Chapter 1: The Silence of the Sold. The auction hall reeked of failure and expensive cologne, a stifling mixture that clung to Aria's skin like a shroud. She knelt, her gaze locked on a tiny imperfection in the grand, cruel scheme of the floor. She was the final, pitiful pawn to settle her family's crushing debt, a transaction that stripped her of the last shred of her autonomy. Because she had learned through brutal experience that remaining small and utterly silent was the sole path to enduring the ceaseless arrogance of the powerful. "I just want to survive quietly," the mantra resonated in the hollow chamber of her heart, a desperate, silent plea against the indifference of fate. She was 22, but time had treated her harshly, replacing youthful dreams with a cold, profound emotional numbness. Her conviction was absolute: love and destiny were fragile, beautiful lies reserved for others. Her canvas was meant only for stains and perpetual resignation. The pack system, which promised loyalty and protection, had instead discarded her onto this cold, public platform. The auctioneer's voice boomed, shattering the silence and announcing the catastrophic pivot in her life. "And now, for the final tribute, the debt is settled with the Northern Crown. This acquisition has been secured by a representative of the highest order." The room instantly fell into a suffocating quiet. The buyer was no mere wealthy lord, it was the Royal Emissary of the Lycan King, His Majesty Kaelen. The name was a low, resonant chord of terrifying, primal power. Lycans were the ancient, volatile apex predators of the shifter world, their lineage steeped in dark, potent magic. Whispers, sharp as ice chips, began to circulate among the nervous few. "The king is cursed. He lost his mate. The mark he gives kills." The fear gripping Aria intensified from a dull ache to a crippling, immediate terror. She was forced to rise and move with the other silent tributes toward the receiving line and out into the biting mountain air. They ascended to the Lycan citadel, a massive fortress of obsidian and iron carved high into the unforgiving black peak. The air was thin, smelling sharply of ozone and a deep, musky scent that spoke only of raw, untamed authority. She was led into the great hall, a vast, echoing space that felt like entering the inner sanctum of a sleeping beast. Her goal remained absolute: disappear. Become a non-entity. She was convinced that any display of vulnerability would only attract the destructive attention of powerful men like this king. She fixed her gaze down, letting the shame and terror consume her. Then, she felt his presence. He was seated on the throne, a massive, daunting silhouette against a towering, lead-colored window. He was a creature of contained strength and profound, ambient coldness. Despite her vow to look away, she risked a quick, fatal upward glance, seeking the source of the overwhelming gravitational pull. Their eyes met. His were a shocking, electric blue, fierce and shadowed. The contact was not curiosity, it was a violent, undeniable recognition, a physical jolt like grasping a live wire that stole her breath. It was a primal, magnetic shock, speaking of a terrifying, unwanted connection that bypassed all her defenses. She immediately snatched her gaze away, dropping her chin to her chest, overwhelmed by the terror of being seen. But the moment was already etched into the atmosphere. She heard a subtle sound from the throne, the rustle of velvet, the barely perceptible stiffening of a body caught utterly off guard. Something profound had shifted in the cold hierarchy of the hall, and because of that single, involuntary recognition, Aria knew she was now tragically involved in a destiny she never wanted. Her simple goal of quiet survival had been brutally shattered by the unspoken promise of fate. The air around the king now vibrated with a palpable, threatening tension, leaving her heart beating a desperate, trapped rhythm. Chapter 2: The Armor and the Alarm. The king stood alone in his private chambers, the silence of the stone castle broken only by the perfectly controlled fire crackling in the massive hearth. He was deliberately ignoring the official confirmation of the tribute's arrival. Kaelen was preparing for the annual debt-cleansing ritual, a tedious political necessity he detested. He desperately wanted to fulfill his duty, coldly assert his dominance over the lesser packs, and retreat back into the comfortable isolation he had relentlessly cultivated for years. He was a king forged from unforgiving granite, his emotional armor absolute and unforgiving. This detachment was more than political maneuvering, it was his sole defense against a crippling, dark secret. He profoundly believed he was cursed, a lethal danger to any mate fate might cruelly send him. The memory of his first mate's death was not just sadness, it was a deep, searing warning that governed every decision. His foundational flaw was a paralyzing fear of desire, utterly convinced that his affections were inherently destructive. He viewed his chosen solitude not as weakness, but as a necessary act of selfless isolation, better to reign alone than to condemn an innocent to a tragic end. He was wrestling with the internal turmoil caused by the day's obligations, when the scent invaded his sanctuary, an overwhelming, profound anomaly. It wasn't the strong, overt, competitive aroma of a potential court partner. This was something subtle, clean, and devastatingly compelling: fresh snow, rain-washed earth, and an underlying, unsettling resilience that resonated with the forgotten, broken core of his own Lycan soul. His wolf, the ancient, powerful silver shadow residing within his spirit, stirred violently. It was an involuntary, agonizing spasm that stole his breath and concentration. The beast rarely breached his consciousness with such demanding intensity, usually held in check by the king's sheer force of will. Now, the Lycan was restless, pacing, flooding Kaelen's mind with a single, resonant declaration that felt like a catastrophic failure: mate. The word hit him like a physical blow. It instantly dismantled the rigorous discipline of years of repression. No. This is utterly impossible. This is a cruel, fatal joke. He instantly recognized the profound and imminent threat to his carefully managed control and his self-imposed safety, because the appearance of a mate meant the inevitable activation of the ancient, fatal curse. The sheer, primal instinct screaming at him to find her, to claim her, to protect her, became a desperate, physical agony he fought with every fiber of his royal and human will. He bolted from his desk, his powerful hands clenching into white-knuckled fists, the movement sharp and uncharacteristic. He paced the long circumference of the room, violently fighting the debilitating, magnetic craving. The Lycan was clearly proclaiming a terrifying truth that his human mind had sworn to deny. I will not accept this bond. He raged internally, the silent shout laced with raw, terrified desperation. He simply could not, absolutely would not, subject another innocent life to the tragedy he carried. But the scent, now strangely laced with a faint, rising thread of terror from the distant tribute hall, pulled at him relentlessly. His wolf was a furious, silver shadow, demanding intervention, demanding attention. Kaelen forced himself to stop, taking long, ragged breaths. He had to be frigid. He had to be the king. He had to reject the connection entirely before it took any further root. He knew, with shattering certainty, that his existence had just shifted, subtly but irreversibly, because of one broken girl and one single, devastating scent. He stormed out of his chambers, not toward the hall, but toward the administration wing, attempting to put as much calculated physical distance between himself and his disastrous fate as possible. Chapter 3: The King's Refusal. A profound, chilling silence descended upon the great hall following the king's swift, unsettling departure. Aria remained kneeling, focusing entirely on regulating her shallow, panicked breathing. The brief, electric recognition she had shared with the king had left her exposed and utterly dizzy. Her mind frantically tried to reconcile the dire whispers of the curse with the raw, unsettling magnetic pull she had felt. Just stay still. Just be quiet. Suddenly, her desperate prayer for anonymity was answered with immediate, shocking violence. A shadow, smelling not of pine or musk but of cloying perfume and arrogant entitlement, fell over her. Lord Silas, the only son of the king's primary political advisor, stood there, his face fixed in a predatory sneer. He had clearly waited for the king to leave. So you're the Lycan's expensive piece of charity, he sneered, his voice a nasty, contemptuous whine. You actually think a mere debt payment makes you special? You're just a temporary replacement for the one he let die. Silas seized her, brutally pulling her up and slamming her against a massive marble pillar. The shock and sharp pain were immediate, stealing her breath. His eyes, dark and vicious, held a profound, unsettling glee. Her heart seized with the sickening realization that this moment embodied the precise, arbitrary cruelty she had always feared, the complete, destructive control powerful men wielded over the weak. Her old wound, the deep, persistent belief that no one will ever fight for me, tore open, instantly transforming her terror into a desperate, feral resolve. She fought back, silent and fierce, clawing at his hands, a desperate, silent battle for her dignity. Silas laughed, a short, cruel sound, and then, with chilling calm, he produced a slender, silver dagger, the polished blade catching the low light and reflecting the stark terror in her eyes. A souvenir to remind you of your status, slave. Just as the dagger began its terrifying arc downward, a sound of absolute, uncontrolled rage ripped through the high hall. Kaelen appeared, a creature of pure, devastating momentum and fury. He was utterly feral. His gold Lycan eyes were blazing, his massive frame radiating an intense, shocking heat that seemed to crack the very air around them. He had felt Aria's sudden, extreme terror, amplified and distorted by the mate bond, and it had instantly triggered a profound, instinctual, protective explosion that demolished his control. He did not speak. He simply struck. Kaelen seized Silas, tearing him away from Aria with a brutal, visceral force. The Lycan was in full, terrifying command. He slammed Silas into the wall, the sound echoing like a distant clap of thunder. The king's rage was not reasoned, it was primal, savage vengeance, driven by the profound agony of his mate's pain. His instinct had violently overridden the rational man and the king, because the protection of the mate transcended all law, all politics, and all self-preservation. He came dangerously close to killing the noble, his fangs extending, ready to end the threat entirely. But just as he brought the crushing power to bear, his eyes locked with Aria's, and he saw not relief or gratitude, but pure, unadulterated, profound terror directed entirely and unequivocally at him. The beast faltered, shocked by the revulsion of its mate. The emotional backlash was instant and catastrophic. He dropped Silas, who crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Kaelen spun toward Aria, the guilt and primal need warring in his gold eyes. He reached for her, compelled by an unbearable need to soothe, to claim, to possess. No, I must not. He screamed internally, fighting the powerful surge of the bond. But the proximity, the fear, the raw, unprotected scent of her vulnerability, it was an overwhelming tidal wave. His control shattered completely. He seized her, pulling her close, and with a guttural, desperate cry that was half snarl and half raw apology, his fangs sank into her neck. It was a blinding strike of pain, followed by a rush of potent, dark magic flooding her system, his marking power, his curse. He marked her. Against his own desperate will. The instant his fangs retracted, a network of brilliant, agonizing runes ignited across her skin, starting at the bite wound and racing across her collarbone. They glowed with an eerie, terrifying power. Aria gasped, a sound of utter betrayal and profound shock, and then the lights went out. She collapsed, unconscious, the king's curse written in fire upon her skin. Kaelen held her, staring down at the dark, damning brand. He had protected her, but in doing so, he had confirmed the terrible prophecy. The man who feared he was cursed had just condemned his own destiny. Chapter 4, The Branding of Fate. Aria surfaced from unconsciousness not with gradual awareness, but with a searing, angry ache at the juncture of her neck and shoulder. The pain was a living entity, throbbing with a low, magical hum that permeated her bone marrow. She was in a massive bed draped with royal blue velvet, the room a study in opulent captivity. Her first instinct was to confirm the disaster. She reached up, fingers trembling, and felt the smooth, tight skin where the king's fangs had sunk deep. It was not merely a wound, it was a magical brand, hot and intensely charged. She scrambled out of the silken sheets, stumbling to the large, mirrored wardrobe. In the reflection, the truth was horrifying and undeniable. Faint, dark runes, like intricate, painful lightning, traced patterns beneath the pale skin of her collarbone and shoulders. The mark, the curse, was physically visible. She was now the condemned queen, a living proof of the prophecy whispered in the hall. The horror that swallowed her breath was absolute. I am going to die, the thought screamed, sharper and colder than any dagger. The mark was proof that the Lycan king was a monster who could not control his lethal power, and she was the consequence. A silent, armored guard stood just inside the massive double doors, a clear indication that her opulent surroundings were nothing more than a cage. She was no longer a slave whose life was worth nothing, she was a political liability whose death was imminent. She was consumed by confusion why a king, afraid of his own curse, would violently claim her only to seal her fate. He should have let Silas kill me, she thought bitterly. That would have been cleaner. A tall, austere woman, the head stewardess, entered without knocking, her face etched with exhaustion and disapproval. You are awake, she stated flatly, placing a tray of untouched food on a side table. The king has assigned you this wing. It is strictly guarded. You are not to leave. Aria approached her, her eyes fixed on the woman's indifferent face. Why? If he marked me, he should claim me as queen, or at least release me. Why hide me? The stewardess sighed, a sound of profound world weariness. The king refuses public acknowledgement. The court is in turmoil over the marking of an auction tribute and the assault on Lord Silas's son. He won't validate the mark, because he believes that claiming you validates the curse. But the bond is set. You are his. He keeps you hidden as his conscience, and as his secret prisoner. The woman's pity was almost harder to bear than her disdain. Aria was now the center of a dangerous, unseen conflict, trapped between a man's terrifying primal instinct and his desperate, cold rejection. She realized her quiet survival was over. Her only path now was to confront the destiny branded onto her skin. Chapter 5: The King's Surveillance. The king stood in his observation annex, a narrow, concealed space overlooking the north guest wing courtyard. He watched the light in Aria's window, a pale, distant beacon that represented everything he desired and everything he was sworn to destroy. He hadn't been close to her since the catastrophic night of the marking. His existence was a perpetual torment, because the bond was a searing, physical craving that mocked his control, while his rational mind screamed warnings of her imminent death. He had assigned the wing to her to keep her hidden, a strategic choice that protected her from the political toxicity of the court and his own dangerous proximity. He protected her with a wall of stone and guards, yet he kept her at a desperate, emotional arm's length. Every morning, the stewardess reported that the markings had not progressed, that she was alive, but the king knew this reprieve was temporary. I must find the counterspell. I must break the curse without breaking her. His internal state was a chaotic battlefield of guilt and pure, feral possessiveness. He saw her pacing near the window, a small figure moving with surprising defiance. He felt a sharp, intrusive spike of her anger through the mate bond, anger directed squarely at him. Good, he thought, the feeling of cold comfort. Let her hate me. It is better than her trusting me. He found himself consumed by an overwhelming, primal urge to observe her, a necessity that transcended simple protection. He needed to confirm with his own eyes that the curse wasn't draining life from her, that the magic he had forced upon her was not immediately fatal. He spent hours in the shadows of the annex, a massive, hidden protector, watching her movements. This was his penance, this was his desperate, silent commitment. He allowed himself this one small act of forbidden closeness. One night, the moon cast long, skeletal shadows across the courtyard. Kaelen watched as Aria pressed her face against the cold glass, her breath misting the pain. He saw the profound loneliness in her posture, a mirror of his own isolated existence. His heart twisted, a painful, physical response he couldn't suppress. She is broken, just like me. Suddenly, Aria spun away from the glass, as if sensing his surveillance. She looked directly at the dark, narrow window where he hid, though she couldn't possibly see him through the specialized glass. That look, direct, challenging, and laced with fear, was the final confirmation that their bond was not a silent contract but a volatile, two-sided fight. He immediately retreated, stepping back into the deeper shadows of the annex. He was shaken, not by her sight, but by the sheer force of her emotional perception. She sees me watching. She knows my guilt. The distance was necessary, but the emotional cost was crushing, fueling both his craving and his debilitating guilt. Chapter 6: The Unbreakable Leash. The confines of the North Wing eventually became unbearable. Aria could no longer endure the suffocating fear of the mark or the silent, desperate knowledge of the king's hidden surveillance. Her internal state had progressed from resignation to a fierce, desperate need for genuine freedom, not just the illusion of safety he offered. She hated the feeling of being bound, of having her emotions hijacked by a man who was simultaneously her captor and her protector. On a cold afternoon, driven by pure instinct, she executed her escape plan. She subdued the guard outside her room, not with violence, but with a swift, unexpected distraction and a calculated slam of the heavy door. She raced through the halls, her bare feet silent on the cold marble, aiming for the lower-level servants' tunnels, a riskier but less guarded path to the outside world. She reached a secluded, iron-wrought service door that opened directly to the mountain trails. Her heart hammered with fierce, desperate hope. "I am free," she thought, pushing her shoulder against the latch. But as she stepped into the biting, snow-laced air, a massive, invisible pressure slammed into her chest. It was the mate bond, but amplified, a sharp, physical tether yanking her back toward the stone walls. It wasn't pain, it was the terrifying, undeniable magnetic force of his ownership. The bond did not just connect them emotionally, it acted as a living, magical leash, overriding her will. She stumbled, dragged back toward the palace entrance, utterly defeated by a force she could not see or fight. She collapsed onto the icy ground, gasping, the humiliation sharp and immediate. She hated the feeling of belonging, and the realization that the bond was real, absolute, and physically controlling was a catastrophic blow. She finally understood why her heart ached sometimes. It was the bond feeding her his guilt, his need, his pain. She wept, the raw tears freezing instantly on her cheeks, fueled by rage, confusion, and the profound sorrow of being perpetually trapped. A sudden, intense warmth enveloped her. Kaelen was there, having tracked her instantly through the screaming bond. He did not touch her, but stood close, his presence radiating immense, soothing heat. He looked ravaged, his kingly composure replaced by a profound, raw desperation. "You cannot leave, Aria," he said, his voice stripped of authority, merely a low, wounded rumble. "It won't allow it. And I won't allow you to choose death." Aria looked up at him, tears still falling. "Why won't you let me go?" she whispered, the challenge lost to her despair. He knelt, his massive form vulnerable in the moonlight. "Because I refuse to accept that I have doomed you," he admitted, his honesty a shocking revelation. It was their first real, non-hostile moment, a raw admission that pierced her emotional armor. Her anger softened into confused empathy. The king who claimed her was also the man terrified of her fate. Chapter 7: The Guarded Gaze. The king stood alone in the shadowed corridor of the East Wing, his senses acutely focused on the North Guest Wing. He was fighting a losing battle against the mate bond. His decision to mark Aria had been a catastrophic, involuntary submission to instinct, and now he was forced to manage the deadly fallout through icy, calculated distance. He had assigned Aria to this guarded, isolated suite to keep her hidden from the politically volatile court and, more critically, to protect her from his own treacherous proximity. He spent hours in the shadows, watching her window, a massive, hidden protector consumed by debilitating guilt. He was maintaining a physical arm's length, because every internal, possessive demand from his Lycan was immediately countered by the chilling memory of the first mate's death. He was convinced that any emotional closeness would inevitably act as the final trigger for the curse's fatal power, therefore his coldness was a desperate act of preservation. He saw her pacing near the window, a small, vibrant figure moving with undeniable defiance. He felt a sharp, intrusive spike of her resentment through the bond, anger directed squarely at him, the man who had stolen her autonomy and sealed her fate. "Let her hate me," he thought, feeling a thin, bitter shield. it is better than her trusting me. He was forced into this perpetual, agonizing surveillance, a necessity that transcended simple protection. He needed to confirm with his own eyes that the curse wasn't draining life from her, that the violent magic he had forced upon her was not immediately fatal. One night, the moon cast long, crystalline shadows across the courtyard. Kaelen watched as Aria pressed her cheek against the cold glass, her posture radiating profound, chilling loneliness. He saw the mirror of his own isolated existence reflected in her quiet despair. He felt a powerful, undeniable surge of empathy, a dangerous emotion he fought violently to suppress. She is broken, just like me, the thought surfaced, forcing him to acknowledge the forbidden connection. Suddenly, Aria spun away from the glass, as if sensing his intense focus. She looked directly at the dark, narrow window where he hid, though she could not possibly penetrate the specialized glass. That look, direct, challenging, and laced with fear, was the final confirmation that their bond was not a silent contract but a volatile, two-sided fight. He immediately retreated, stepping back into the deeper darkness of the annex. He was shaken, not by her sight, but by the sheer, terrifying force of her emotional perception. The emotional cost of his calculated distance was crushing, fueling both his primal craving and his debilitating, constant guilt. Chapter 8: The Price of Belonging. The confines of the North Wing eventually became unbearable, suffocating Aria under the weight of her fear and the silent knowledge of the king's hidden surveillance. Her previous resignation had hardened into a desperate, ferocious need for genuine autonomy, rejecting the false safety of her opulent cage. She loathed the feeling of being bound, of having her emotions hijacked by a man who was simultaneously her captor and her inevitable doom. Driven by pure, frantic instinct, she executed her plan. She slipped past the guard, her heart a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs, aiming for a less-used service door that promised an escape to the mountain trails. She ran, because the terror of being cursed to die slowly in luxury was far greater than the terror of being caught in the wild. She reached the iron-wrought service door and pushed her shoulder against the latch. A surge of fierce, intoxicating hope consumed her. I am free, she thought, stepping into the biting, snow-laced air. But as she took her first free step, a massive, invisible pressure slammed into her chest. It was the mate bond, but amplified, a sharp, physical tether yanking her back toward the stone walls. It was not pain, but the terrifying, undeniable magnetic force of his ownership and his magical proximity. The bond did not just connect them emotionally, it acted as a living, controlling leash, overriding her physical will. She stumbled, dragged back toward the entrance, utterly defeated by a force she could neither see nor fight. She collapsed onto the icy ground, gasping, the humiliation sharp and absolute. She despised the feeling of belonging, and the realization that the bond was a real, physical constraint was a catastrophic blow to her sense of self. She realized that the unexplained ache she sometimes felt was the bond feeding her his guilt, his need, his profound, crushing pain. She wept, the raw tears instantly freezing on her cheeks, fueled by rage, confusion, and the despair of perpetual entrapment. A sudden, intense warmth enveloped her. Kaelen was there, having tracked her instantly through the screaming bond. He did not touch her, but stood close, his entire immense presence radiating a necessary, desperate heat. He looked ravaged, the cold mask of the king replaced by profound, raw vulnerability. You cannot leave, Aria, he said, his voice stripped of authority, merely a low, wounded rumble. The bond won't allow it. And I won't allow you to choose death outside these walls. Aria looked up at him, tears still falling onto the snow. Why won't you let me go, she whispered, her defiance lost in sorrow. He knelt, his massive frame utterly vulnerable in the moonlight. Because I refuse to accept that I have doomed you, he admitted, his honesty a shocking, raw revelation. It was their first shared, non-hostile moment, a raw admission that pierced her emotional armor. Her rage softened into confused empathy. The king who claimed her was also the man terrified of her tragic fate. Chapter 9: The Test of Fire. The fragile, vulnerable moment in the snow was brutally shattered as the castle's massive outer wards began to scream. The alarm was not a mechanical sound, but a high-pitched, magical wail that signified a serious external breach. Kaelen instantly went rigid, the tenderness draining from his face, replaced by the fierce, cold mask of the king. He pulled Aria to her feet, his touch now firm and commanding. The shared moment of weakness was immediately superseded by the terrifying necessity of survival against a lethal, outside force. Before Kaelen could issue an order, the atmosphere thickened, growing heavy and metallic, like blood mixed with ozone. A figure shimmered into existence near the courtyard entrance, cloaked in ragged black linen, her eyes burning with an unnatural, toxic green light. It was a witch, ancient and powerful, her energy focused and malevolent. She was clearly an advanced scout for the Witch Council, because the magical assault was targeted directly at the source of the curse. The witch lunged, not for Kaelen, but directly for Aria, her hand outstretched, tipped with claws of solidified shadow. The bonded slave must be purged, she shrieked, her voice echoing with dark power. Kaelen roared, a primal sound of absolute rejection and protective fury. He shoved Aria behind him, his Lycan taking immediate, violent command. He shifted partially, his muscles swelling, his claws extending, a massive, snarling shield of silver and midnight. The Lycan's protective instinct was a breathtaking, terrifying spectacle, defending the mate it had claimed against its owner's will. The bond flared between them, a painful, unifying jolt of energy, his rage flooding Aria, her fear sharpening his predatory focus. Aria did not flee. Driven by the intrusive spike of his desperate fury, she found a cold, lethal calm. While Kaelen engaged the witch in a brutal, blinding clash of silver and shadow, Aria seized the discarded silver dagger dropped during her earlier fight. She was determined to fight, because the king's terrifying commitment had now become her own chance to prove she was worthy of survival. When the witch dodged Kaelen's devastating strike, momentarily exposing her flank, Aria moved. She darted forward, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, and slashed the witch's exposed arm. The witch howled, a sound of agony and pure fury, the silver burning her ancient flesh. She spun, leveling her toxic gaze at Aria, her power momentarily disrupted. "Foolish girl," the witch hissed, her voice laced with venom. "You are his doom." She lifted a hand, preparing a final, devastating blast of shadow magic directed at Kaelen. But Kaelen was faster. He struck the witch with a blinding sweep of his massive claw, severing the magical connection to her power. The witch exploded into a cloud of freezing smoke, leaving only a dark, residual scorch mark on the stone. As the smoke cleared, the king turned back to Aria, his breathing ragged, the gold receding from his eyes. He saw her standing there, armed and resolute, her marked skin faintly glowing with the magic they had just shared. The danger was past, but the witch's parting words hung heavy in the cold air. "She is your doom, and your salvation." Chapter 10, The Weight of Silence. The aftermath of the witch's attack and her subsequent involvement in the defense of the palace resulted in a swift escalation of political tension. Kaelen increased the guard detail, but the silent, judging eyes of the Lycan court members were impossible to ignore. She remained the forbidden subject, the immense elephant carved from marble and curse. Aria was forced to attend a palace ceremony, a disastrous political necessity to show the powerful council that the king was in control and that she was merely a protected, anonymous guest, despite the recent violence. The experience was profoundly humiliating. Nobles, immediately recognizing her as the auction tribute and the undeniable cause of the recent chaos and the king's erratic behavior, turned their backs as she approached, their collective disdain palpable and cutting. Whispers, sharp and cruel as obsidian shards, followed her like a cold, judging shadow. The cursed slave. The king's foolish mistake. She will inevitably bring him down. She felt a devastating sense of profound powerlessness, a corrosive return to her old, poisonous belief system. She walked through the opulent hall, trying desperately to maintain a semblance of composure, but the shame was a burning brand across her chest. "This is my reality, after all," she thought bitterly, her shoulders slumping with despair. I am still the unworthy one, no matter how fiercely he fights. Her old, deep wound, the belief that no one will ever fight for me, tore open, raw and immediate. She risked a glance toward Kaelen, a desperate, silent plea for acknowledgement, for support, but he stood apart near the dais, distant, severe, engaged in a cold, necessary conversation with his most powerful council members. He maintained a profound, agonizing silence regarding the attack, the mark, and their terrifying connection. His silence was a brutal betrayal, because it clearly suggested her worth was still tied to his public fear, not his private, vulnerable commitment. Her resentment for his emotional cowardice grew, a sharp, bitter plant flowering in her heart. She finished the ceremony trying only to endure the crushing humiliation, retreating into the deep emotional shell she had worn all her life. From across the crowded, silent room, Kaelen watched. He watched the nobles openly turn their backs. He watched the calculated, vicious cruelty of his court. He watched Aria's shoulders slump and the spark dim in her eyes. He felt her pain and the corrosive shame through the bond, and his hands clenched, knuckles turning bone white with suppressed, terrifying fury. I cannot defend her here, he told himself, the rationalization thin and utterly bitter. I cannot show public favoritism, it would instantly trigger the council's next, more devastating political move. But the rational excuse did nothing to dampen the pure, searing guilt that engulfed him. He was consciously choosing his crown over her dignity, his political survival over her emotional well-being. He was punishing himself with paralyzing inaction, forcing himself to watch her suffer the same isolation he endured. He felt the cold, familiar stinging where his nails dug into his palms. The distance was meant to protect her, but he knew with shattering clarity it was merely torturing them both, and that she was nearing her breaking point. Chapter 11, The Lie That Fractures. Kaelen retreated to his most secure war room following the disastrous ceremony, consumed by a suffocating mixture of cold rage and overwhelming, debilitating guilt. He had witnessed Aria's public humiliation and done nothing, a cowardly choice that tore at the protective, Lycan core of his very soul. His fear of the curse was proving greater than his love, and that devastating, absolute truth made him feel like a monstrous failure. He was studying ancient council scrolls, searching for any magical mechanism to sever the bond without killing Aria, when the final, crippling piece of the puzzle snapped into place. The text was archaic, bound in brittle, centuries-old dragon leather, detailing the history of the Lycan king's lineage and the origin of his famous, lethal curse. He discovered the truth: his first mate, Aria, did not die because he marked her. She had died a month after the marking, yes, but the scroll detailed a covert, horrific ritual executed by the Witch Council to interrupt the sacred mate bond and deliberately drain the mate's life force, not for personal vengeance, but specifically to control the king. They knew Kaelen's potential power was immense, and that the natural, unified mate bond would make him magically unstoppable. They killed Aria to maintain political leverage, allowing Kaelen to internalize the tragedy and believe the fatality was his own inherent curse. The realization struck Kaelen with the force of a catastrophic, emotional earthquake. The entire emotional foundation of his fear, his decades of isolation, and his punishing self-hatred was a calculated, vicious political lie orchestrated by his most trusted, closest enemies. He hadn't been an uncontrolled monster, he had been a grieving, utterly manipulated victim, punishing himself for a crime the Witch Council committed. His calculated isolation wasn't salvation, it was 30 years of successful political incapacitation. Shock gave way immediately to a cold, incandescent rage that was purer and more focused than anything his Lycan had ever generated. He realized he had unjustly withheld his love and essential protection from Aria, because he had blindly punished himself for a devastating, deliberate deception. The true enemy was not his curse or his power, but the council's relentless thirst for political, manipulative power. He had to find Aria. Immediately. Kaelen burst out of the war room and raced toward the private wings, his immense focus now singular and absolute. He found Aria in a secluded library corridor, her face pale, still radiating the residual sadness of her earlier public humiliation. He grabbed her arm, his touch urgent and intense, pulling her toward the nearest private gathering space. "They lied to me," he rasped, his eyes blazing, his voice thick with a raw, terrifying new understanding. "It was never my fault. It was never the mark." Chapter 12, The Unbreakable Choice. Aria stared at Kaelen, his confession striking her with the force of an unexpected wave. His eyes were wild, no longer clouded by guilt but burning with incandescent, righteous fury. His revelation, that the curse was a political weapon and his isolation a decades-long lie, immediately shattered the last vestiges of her emotional shell. She felt confused, emotional, and the brittle armor she had worn since childhood began to fracture. "They lied to me," he repeated, his voice raw with a fury that shook his massive frame. He confessed the lie of his first mate's death and publicly denounced the humiliation she had just endured, choosing her and their bond over all political discretion. The dynamic between them shifted violently, finally transitioning from captor/prisoner to something immediate, protective, and overwhelmingly volatile. They stood close, the air charged with the terrifying potential of their sudden, burgeoning connection. He was protective, almost possessive, and she was confused but deeply moved by the shocking honesty that had cost him his control. They leaned in, drawn by the undeniable magnetic force, almost kissing, the moment suspended, fragile, and utterly consuming. When the mate bond flared, hotter and sharper than it had ever been before. A new, terrifying thought ripped into both their minds, a clear, powerful prophecy transmitted by the very magic that bound them: one must die for the other to live. The ultimatum struck them like a physical blow, freezing them inches apart. Aria recoiled, the confusing tenderness instantly replaced by cold dread. "I am his doom," the witch's words echoed in her mind. Kaelen stiffened, the passionate defense of his innocence draining away, replaced by the agonizing return of absolute fear. The curse, even if politically manipulated, still demanded a sacrifice. Kaelen pulled back fully, his hand dropping from her arm. He stared at her, his jaw rigid, the agonizing realization of the immediate danger paralyzing him. He had just discovered the truth, that he wasn't the monster, only to be confronted by a new, equally fatal ultimatum. He saw the terror in Aria's eyes and knew the bond, once a weapon against him, was now a ticking clock demanding one of their lives. "I refuse to lose her to their machinations," he swore, a silent, furious vow that warred with the primal terror of the prophecy. Aria looked at the sudden renewed agony in his eyes and felt a resurgence of her old, self-sacrificing core. If one must die, it should be the slave. Her old wound, the belief that she was unworthy of being saved, tried to reassert its dominance. The entire dynamic was now defined by this fatal prophecy. Chapter 13, The Fire Within. The agonizing prophecy, "one must die for the other to live," had severed the fragile trust they had just forged, forcing them into immediate, decisive action. Aria felt the weight of the ultimatum pressing down on her, yet Kaelen's recent public defense and his raw honesty about the Witch Council's lie had fundamentally altered her core belief system. The idea that she was worthy of fighting for, planted during the humiliation of the ceremony, now bloomed into a fierce, absolute determination. She refused to be the passive victim waiting for the curse to claim her life. She committed fully to understanding the powerful, dark magic now coursing through her veins. She plunged into the secluded Lycan archives, a vast, stone-lined labyrinth dedicated to ancient mate bonds and lethal magical histories. She devoured arcane texts and dusty scrolls, searching for any obscure loophole, any counter-magic to sever the curse without severing the life tether between them. This quest was fueled not by fear, but by a growing, steady pride in her own resolve. Simultaneously, she demanded intense physical training from the king's most trusted captain of the guard, not to learn to fight with a sword, but to understand and harness the raw energy awakened by the mark. She needed to control the Lycan power she inadvertently carried, because passive victimhood was no longer an option when fate was demanding her life. She spent hours in a hidden courtyard, her focus absolute, learning to channel the foreign power that surged through her body every time Kaelen came near. Kaelen watched her transformation from a distance, observing the shift from resigned slave to active participant. He saw the resilience that had first drawn his wolf now bloom into focused, formidable strength. He saw her poring over scrolls, her brow furrowed in fierce concentration, her body moving with newfound, deliberate grace during training sessions. He watched the woman he had bought become a warrior, stepping purposefully into the destructive destiny she had once frantically fled. One evening, he approached her as she concluded a difficult training session, her breath ragged but her eyes sharp with victory. The setting sun caught the intricate runes of the mark, causing them to glow faintly beneath her skin, radiating a soft, controlled heat. She looked up, catching his eye across the wide, empty space. She didn't look terrified or resigned, she looked empowered and openly challenging. Kaelen felt a powerful surge of desire mingled with profound respect, an emotion far deeper than simple lust. He saw the fierce, unyielding fire in her eyes, a perfect reflection of the ancient Lycan spirit he carried. This was not the broken tribute he had bought, this was the formidable, vital partner his wolf had chosen. This was the first time Aria saw herself truly glow, radiating not just raw magical power, but intrinsic, rediscovered self-worth. Her transformation was complete internally, fueled by the conviction that she was worthy of surviving the fate he had forced upon her. She had chosen to fight alongside him. Chapter 14, The Confession of Fear. The relentless pressure of the prophecy, compounded by Aria's terrifying embrace of power, drove Kaelen to the edge of breakdown. He had spent his life convinced that love brought death, and now, watching Aria grow stronger, the prophecy mocked his fragile relief. Her transformation into a capable partner was a constant, excruciating reminder that the Witch Council's ultimatum was imminent. He was trapped in a vortex of conflicting needs. The Lycan demanded union and strength, the king demanded control and safety, the man demanded an end to the pervasive, agonizing fear. He found Aria alone late one night in the library, tracing the complex diagram of a nullification spell in an ancient text. The silence was thick with the pulsating anxiety of the mate bond. He needed to confess his deepest fear, not as the king who protects, but as the man who is profoundly terrified of his own shadow. He approached her slowly, deliberately stripping away the layers of his royal detachment. He sat opposite her, placing his massive hands flat on the table, a gesture of absolute, difficult surrender. "I am not afraid of the witches," he began, his voice low, raw, and barely controlled. "I am afraid of my choice. If I allow myself to love you without reservation, you will inevitably die. That is what happened before. That is what the curse guarantees." He spoke of his first mate, Alara, not with cold detachment, but with the visceral pain of a man reliving the tragedy. He recounted the moment she collapsed, the coldness of her skin, the silent, pervasive guilt that followed him like a hound. He shared the painful scenario of his past to ensure Aria understood the very real cost of their emotional closeness. Aria listened, her expression shifting from focused concentration to deep, unnerving pity. When he finished, the silence was absolute, broken only by the crackle of a distant fire. The bond pulsed, conveying not fear, but a profound, aching sorrow for his long years of self-imposed punishment. She reached out, tentatively, placing her hand gently over his massive, rigid one. Her touch was warm, surprisingly firm, and completely void of fear. "Your fear is a lie the witches sold you," she stated, her voice soft but filled with a new, quiet conviction. "We know the truth now. The curse is a weapon used against you, not one you carry." She looked directly into his tormented eyes, her own shining with a sudden, devastating clarity. "Maybe I'm not meant to die, Kaelen," she whispered, the prophecy momentarily silenced by her defiance. "Maybe I'm meant to save you, by choosing life. By proving their lie wrong." Her touch was the first true act of intimacy they had shared, a difficult surrender of her emotional defenses. She admitted her desire but resisted his fear, forcing him to look beyond the past tragedy toward the terrifying potential of their future. Chapter 15, The Snow-Laced Surrender. The intimacy of the library confession, Aria's profound, gentle touch and Kaelen's raw, broken vulnerability, was the point of no return. They had spoken the unspeakable, choosing emotional honesty over self-preservation. The stakes doubled immediately, because their love was no longer theoretical, it was an active threat against the Witch Council's power structure. Their fragile peace was immediately shattered by a fierce, targeted assassination attempt. A small, elite squad of black-robed assassins, dispatched by the council, infiltrated the inner fortress. The alarms were delayed, the palace guards compromised. Kaelen seized Aria, his Lycan taking command, knowing they could not fight the entire palace within the walls. They bolted through a secret access tunnel, forced into a snowy forest escape. The sudden flight was immediate, brutal, and terrifying, pushing their bond to its absolute limit. They ran for hours, weaving through the dense, snow-laden black pines. The cold was punishing, biting through their thin, court clothing. Kaelen's immense strength kept them moving, but Aria's human endurance flagged rapidly. He finally found a shallow, sheltered cave carved into the base of a cliff face. He pulled her inside, shielding her from the driving blizzard. Aria was shivering uncontrollably, her skin pale, her lips blue. The bond flared violently, transmitting pure, terrifying desire mingled with raw, immediate vulnerability, forcing them to cling to each other for warmth and survival. Kaelen knelt, stripping off his heavy, fur-lined coat and wrapping her tightly. He gathered dry kindling with impossible speed, starting a small, desperate fire. But the fire was not enough to combat the bitter cold permeating their bones. He pulled her against his chest, holding her tightly, his own body radiating an intense, protective heat. This was their first intimate scene, an intimacy born entirely of necessity and absolute fear, not tender courtship. Aria buried her face against the firm, warm curve of his neck, inhaling the intoxicating, musky scent of ozone and pine that was uniquely his. Her fear of the curse was momentarily eclipsed by the primal, desperate need for warmth and the overwhelming magnetic pull of the bond. She realized that being safe meant being consumed by his presence, and she willingly surrendered to the terrifying truth. Kaelen felt her shuddering response and lowered his head, his breath ragged and warm against her ear. He whispered her name, his voice thick with a desire he could no longer resist. If we die together, the thought flashed through his mind, stripping away the last of his fear. He moved, seeking her mouth, his hunger absolute. They shared their first real, deliberate kiss, a kiss that was fiercely protective, desperately intimate, and utterly consuming. It was a mutual surrender to a destiny they were both fighting to defy. As their lips met, the small, hidden cave seemed to contract with the energy of their union, and outside, visible through the opening, the sky cracked with a sudden, terrifying bolt of blue lightning, leaving a massive, searing curse sign etched momentarily across the heavy, snow-filled sky. Chapter 16, The Feral Descent. The aftermath of the forced intimacy in the snowy cave was a fragile, dangerous vulnerability. The curse sign etched into the sky served as a brutal cosmic veto on their love, amplifying Kaelen's fear with lethal precision. He had been reckless, giving in to instinct, and now the threat was magnified. He guided Aria back toward a distant, hidden Lycan outpost, his heart a raw, painful knot of devotion and crushing anxiety. He knew the Witch Council would see their bond strengthen and respond with finality. They found a remote, secure hunting cabin, a temporary sanctuary. Kaelen left Aria there, guarded by his most trusted, small detail, and immediately returned to the capital. He had to regain control, fortify the palace, and prepare for the inevitable political storm. The storm broke immediately upon his return. His entire inner circle, including the chief advisor whose son Silas Kaelen had nearly been killed, was gathered, waiting. They did not bow. They did not greet him. The betrayal was instantaneous, silent, and absolute. The chief advisor, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury, addressed him. Your Majesty has abandoned your duty for a marked slave. The council demands your resignation. We have proof of your instability and your willingness to sacrifice the pack's safety for a curse. Kaelen felt the blood drain from his face, replaced by a sudden, icy clarity. He realized the council had used his guilt to manipulate him, and now they were using his love to depose him. He saw the hidden motives, the carefully orchestrated conspiracy, and the sickening depths of their deception. But the worst realizations slammed into him with the weight of granite. While I was running, they were planning. Before he could react, the entire council moved, a practiced, coordinated maneuver. They were not just political figures, they were magically bound conspirators. A wave of binding magic, cold and intense, slammed into Kaelen, designed to suppress his Lycan power. He fought the spell, roaring a sound of pure, feral desperation and rage. He shifted partially, his claws ripping the stone floor, his strength surging in defiance, but the collective power was overwhelming. He spiraled emotionally, because he could not fight a betrayal this absolute, and he knew instantly what this meant for Aria. Through the chaos, a hidden, cloaked figure, a powerful, unseen witch allied with the council, spoke one single, damning sentence: "The slave has been collected, Majesty. Your leverage is now ours." Panic, cold and suffocating, seized Kaelen. Aria was taken. His trusted guards had failed. His self-blame was a crushing, physical weight, plunging him into the abyss of his deepest wound. I cannot protect the ones I love. He went absolutely feral, the suppression spell tearing at his consciousness. He struggled against the magical chains, a caged, howling beast, his world dissolving into a red haze of agonizing failure. Chapter 17, The Weight of Sacrifice. Aria's awakening was slow, painful, and cold. She was not in the king's castle or the snowy hunting cabin. She was in a cavernous, dark room carved from ancient rock, the air thick with the metallic scent of old magic and a familiar, cloying perfume. She was in the heart of the Witch Council's territory, the place where Kaelen's fate had been initially sealed. She immediately understood the situation: betrayal. The guards Kaelen had trusted must have been compromised. Her mind was foggy, her body weak, and the curse mark on her neck was throbbing with an intense, agonizing rhythm, pulsing faster than her own heart. A tall, austere woman entered the chamber, accompanied by several cloaked figures. This was the true power behind the political machinations, the High Witch of the Council. She did not sneer, her expression was one of cold, detached finality. "The Lycan king has failed," the witch stated, her voice smooth and chilling. "His political power has been severed. Now, we deal with the final variable, the mate bond." The witch approached Aria, her green eyes piercing. "You carry the other half of the curse's power, child. The king forced his lethal magic upon you, thinking he was merely marking you. But his bond is unique. It is a shared channel that must be severed to prevent him from regaining control." The witch lifted a hand, and the dark runes on Aria's skin began to burn with excruciating heat. The pain was unbearable, but through it, the terrifying, fatal truth was revealed: the magic was designed so that one must die to stabilize the other. The curse, when fully triggered, sought to consume one life to empower the survivor. If Kaelen were to live, Aria had to be the sacrifice. Aria's heart shattered, replacing fear with a profound, crippling sense of utter loneliness and despair. She was alone, lost, and faced with the ultimate, agonizing choice. Her old, deep wound, "I'm not worth saving," returned full force, amplified by the realization that her death was the only thing that could truly secure Kaelen's future and protect his people from the Witch Council's absolute dominance. She felt the residual echoes of Kaelen's own panic through the bond, the crushing force of his self-blame. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her soul, that he would eventually choose his pack and his throne over her life. He was the king, his sacrifice was his crown. She began to believe that she could never truly be the queen, she was only ever meant to be the sacrifice. The witch offered her a slow, malevolent smile. "Choose wisely, little slave. Surrender the power, and he lives without this endless torment. Fight, and you both fall to the council." Aria closed her eyes, tears of absolute despair tracing paths down her cheeks. She was utterly broken, alone, and resigned. She prepared herself to surrender, to sacrifice her life for the one she was tragically bound to. Chapter 18, The Darkest Night. Kaelen's mind was a maelstrom of furious, desperate strategies, all buried beneath layers of intense, magically induced pain. He had escaped the Council's clutches in a brutal, bloody fight, tearing through the compromised guards and shifting fully into his Lycan form, a decision born entirely of desperation. He was no longer a king, he was a feral beast driven by the singular, agonizing need to reclaim his mate. He tracked Aria using the faint, painful signal of the mate bond, an agonizing locator that led him deep into the forbidden, treacherous territory of the Witch Council. He ignored the warnings, the traps, and the endless psychological warfare the witches threw at him. He pushed through exhaustion and raw wounds, driven by the crushing, absolute guilt that he had failed her at the most critical moment. I let them take you. I can't protect the ones I love, his mind screamed. He finally reached the subterranean chamber, a scene of profound despair. Aria stood near a massive, circular stone altar, surrounded by the cloaked witches, their hands raised, drawing her strength. She was pale, shaking, and utterly resigned. She was actively preparing to surrender to the magic, to sacrifice her life for his freedom, her eyes reflecting complete, heartbreaking emptiness. Their emotional arc had hit absolute zero. Kaelen roared, bursting into the chamber. He was a magnificent, terrifying vision of silver fur and savage fury. He attacked the surrounding witches, tearing through their magical defenses with a brute strength born of love and desperation. He reached Aria just as the lead witch completed the final incantation, beginning the process of draining her life force. He seized her, pulling her close, sheltering her with his vast, powerful body. His fear was absolute, terrifyingly close to the terror he had felt when he lost his first mate. Aria looked up at his feral, wounded face, her gaze vacant with profound despair. She did not see her king, she saw the tragic future he deserved. She pulled away from his desperate grasp, choosing the fate she had been running from, believing it was the only way for him to survive. "Let me go," she whispered, her voice a thin, raw thread. "You deserved a powerful mate. You deserved the throne. You deserved Alara. You deserved the queen who wasn't sold for debt." The painful, final whisper of her self-contempt was a devastating truth. Not a slave. And she intentionally released her hold on her own energy, preparing to surrender to the witch's fatal draw. Kaelen felt her choice, a cold, sickening emptiness through the bond. He held her shattered body, utterly paralyzed by the depth of her despair and her willing self-sacrifice. They were broken. Their only chance at love was dying in his arms. Chapter 19, The Choice of Destiny. The agonizing emptiness that followed Aria's whisper of surrender, not a slave, was the darkest moment of Kaelen's existence. He held her collapsing body, feeling her will to live evaporate, and the raw, cold terror of failure threatened to consume him whole. He looked at the surrounding witches, their faces triumphant, drawing her strength, and realized this was not just a battle for his crown, it was a cosmic battle against the lie that had defined his entire life. They wanted him to choose the throne, to accept the sacrifice, and to live in perpetual, controlled misery. In that instant, everything shifted. The king, the Lycan, and the man unified with a terrifying, absolute clarity. He saw the truth of the prophecy, not as a magical demand, but as a political weapon used to force a choice. He refused to choose the throne over her life, because that was the very defeat the Witch Council had planned for decades. He refused to accept the death of the woman his heart had irrevocably chosen. He tightened his grip on Aria, pulling her fiercely against his massive chest. His Lycan roared in defiance, a sound that shook the ancient rock of the cavern. He unleashed a primal surge of energy, shattering the weak suppression spells the witches had placed on him earlier. He had spent his life protecting his people, now he would protect his destiny, which was inextricably tied to her survival. He looked at Aria, her eyes still vacant with resignation. He poured his immense, royal power of the raw, untamed magic of the Lycan king, directly into the mate bond, flooding her with protective, life-affirming energy. He was making a profound, non-negotiable vow. "You will not die for my throne," Kaelen growled, his voice a low, fierce sound of absolute conviction. He looked directly at the High Witch, his eyes burning with gold. "I choose her. I reject your prophecy. I reject your control." He looked back at Aria, his eyes filled with a love so fierce and absolute it banished the shadows. "You were never meant to be my doom. You were never meant to be a sacrifice," he declared, the words stripping away her final, agonizing despair. "You were my destiny. You were always my queen." This declaration, a choice of love over power, of destiny over prophecy, was Kaelen's ultimate triumph over his fear and guilt. He had finally become the king he was meant to be, a ruler defined by the strength of his commitment, not the severity of his curse. He held her, waiting for the life he had just gifted her to take root, knowing the fight had only just begun. Chapter 20, The Worthy Ascent. Kaelen's sudden, fierce influx of power and his absolute declaration, "You were always my queen," struck Aria with a force more potent than the witch's draining spell. His rejection of the curse and his choice of her over his throne was the ultimate, shattering confirmation of her intrinsic worth. The agonizing belief that she was only a slave, only a sacrifice, immediately crumbled into dust. She felt the profound, warm surge of his Lycan power rushing into her mark, knitting the threads of her retreating energy back together. It was a baptism by fire, a transformative surge that demanded she either live up to his faith or perish in her own self-contempt. She chose life, because Kaelen's sacrifice of his crown made her survival a necessary act of rebellion against the council. Aria inhaled sharply, the air burning in her lungs, and she pushed away the cold emptiness. The dark runes on her skin, which had been draining her, suddenly glowed with an intense, pure silver light, his power, now channeled and accepted by her core. The transformation was instantaneous. She accepted that she was worthy of both his love and the immense, terrifying power she carried. She pushed herself up, standing beside Kaelen, facing the stunned witches. She was no longer pale or weak, her body thrummed with a focused, controlled energy. She reached out and deliberately placed her hand against Kaelen's chest, accepting the full flow of the mate bond, confirming their union in the face of the prophecy. "He does not choose the throne," Aria stated, her voice stronger than it had ever been, clear and vibrating with the newly accepted power. She looked directly at the High Witch, her fear entirely gone, replaced by a fierce, righteous calm. "I chose him. And I refuse the terms of your curse." Her true ability, dormant and suppressed by years of humiliation and worthlessness, ignited in that moment. It was not Kaelen's raw strength, but the focused, unifying magic of the mate bond itself, now amplified by their mutual, chosen commitment. The cave lights dimmed, the witch's shadows faltered, and the energy around her crackled with silver and blue. She had accepted her power, stepping fully into her role not just as a mate, but as a potent, essential force alongside the king. The internal transformation was complete. Aria, the auction tribute, was now the empowered partner, ready to fight beside the king who had finally chosen to be saved. Chapter 21, The Final Alignment. The witches, staggered by Kaelen's ferocious defiance and Aria's sudden, powerful magical awakening, briefly retreated into a defensive circle. The air in the cavern was charged, the tension stretched to a breaking point. They were no longer two broken individuals, they were a unified, potent front, facing down the centuries-old conspiracy that had tried to destroy them. Kaelen seized the momentary pause, pulling Aria close, their connection a burning, tangible lifeline. He looked down at her, seeing the fierce, unwavering resolution in her eyes, and knew his choice had been correct. He had sacrificed his political power to the council, but he had gained a destiny that was stronger than any throne. "Their strength is in division and fear," Kaelen rasped, his eyes scanning the witch's formation. "The curse demands separation. Our only weapon is absolute union. Aria nodded, her hand gripping his arm fiercely. She understood instantly. The prophecy, one must die for the other to live, was designed to make them retreat from the bond. Their only path to victory was to run toward it. She realized that the power she carried, his cursed magic, was also the key to breaking the curse itself, provided they were fully aligned. They began to formulate the final, desperate plan together. They analyzed the weaknesses in the witch's formation and the flow of the draining spell. Their internal dialogue was seamless, a terrifying, silent exchange of strategy and commitment facilitated entirely by the mate bond. "We must overload the connection," Aria transmitted, her thoughts clear and focused in his mind. "The curse feeds on life force, but if we channel pure, unified power through the mark, we can use their own magical conduit against them." "It requires absolute synchronization," Kaelen responded, his agreement immediate. "And it will expose the mark to their full force. It could still kill you." Aria met his gaze, unflinching. "We fight together, or we fall separately. The choice has already been made, Majesty." With that final, fierce alignment, the last barriers between them dissolved. They were strong, emotionally aligned, and ready to face the impossible consequence of their choice. Kaelen looked at the witches, who were now preparing their next, massive attack. The final battle had begun, and their love, no longer dangerous, was now their most volatile and powerful weapon. They moved as one, stepping away from the altar and directly toward the enemy. Chapter 22, The Sacrifice of Union. The final confrontation exploded in the ancient rock cavern. The witches, led by their furious High Witch, unleashed a devastating wave of dark, binding magic, attempting to physically separate Kaelen and Aria and complete the life-draining ritual. The witches fought with absolute ferocity, because their power over the Lycan king depended entirely on the execution of the prophecy. Kaelen roared, meeting the incoming magical assault with a protective, magnificent surge of his own raw Lycan strength. He shielded Aria, pushing her behind him, but she refused to remain a passive recipient of his protection. She was the essential conduit for their plan. Aria knew that the curse itself had to be confronted and neutralized through the power it sought to divide. She pushed forward, moving past Kaelen's immense, protective body, and purposefully positioned herself directly over the magical altar where the draining spell was centered. This was her sacrifice, to absorb the full, concentrated force of the curse into her mark. Kaelen saw her intent, his fear spiking to a critical, agonizing level through the bond, but he trusted her resolve, recognizing the terrifying brilliance of her plan. The High Witch, seeing Aria willingly step onto the altar, smiled a triumphant, chilling smile and channeled the full power of the curse into the mark. The runes on Aria's skin flared with an unbearable, white-hot agony. The magic was draining her life force at a devastating speed. The pain was absolute, a total surrender to the fatal bargain. Kaelen fought off the immediate attacks from the surrounding witches, his focus now solely on Aria. He rushed to the altar, grasping her shoulders with a firm, absolute grip. He looked into her eyes, eyes that held pain, fear, and a terrifying, necessary finality. He poured every last vestige of his life force and Lycan power through the mate bond, overloading the magical connection they shared. He was not fighting the curse, he was joining it, deliberately sharing the pain and the burden. Their unified power, his strength and her focus, slammed into the parasitic curse magic. The sheer, overwhelming voltage of their combined life forces, moving together through the cursed channel, created a catastrophic magical feedback loop. The entire cavern shook, filled with a blinding flash of silver and blue light. The prophecy shattered, the curse dissolving under the weight of their total, chosen union. The force was so immense it ripped through the witches' circle, sending them flying against the ancient stone walls. Aria collapsed, her body heavy and still, the silver light draining from her skin. Kaelen caught her, his own body trembling, utterly spent. The chamber was silent. The curse was dead, but the terrifying question remained, had they both paid the ultimate price? Chapter 23, The Stabilized Bond. Kaelen held Aria's still, heavy body against the cold stone of the altar, his heart hammering with a raw, agonizing fear that dwarfed all the political and magical battles they had faced. The silence in the cavern was complete, broken only by his ragged, desperate breathing. He searched the bond, the lifeline that had just carried them through hell, but found only a fragile, terrifying stillness. He refused to accept her death. He refused to accept that the ultimate sacrifice had been demanded after all. He pressed his hand against the faint, now dormant runes on her skin, pouring his residual life force into her, a desperate, silent plea for her return. The other witches, wounded and defeated, began to flee the collapsing chamber, their ancient power source broken. Kaelen ignored them, his world narrowed to the fragile, cold life in his arms. A moment later, a small, barely perceptible spark flickered through the mate bond, a soft, warm flutter, like a breath of spring air after a long, brutal winter. Aria's fingers twitched against the silver fur of his cloak. She gasped, a shallow, painful sound, and slowly opened her eyes. They were unfocused at first, but then locked onto him. She was weak, emotional, and utterly relieved, gazing up at the face of the king who had chosen her over destiny itself. The curse was truly dead. Kaelen lowered his head, his strength returning in a sudden, overwhelming wave of relief and love. He didn't speak, he simply held her, the full weight of the political and magical storm washing away in the safety of their shared silence. Their bond, which had been a parasitic threat, now stabilized, growing stronger, deeper, and more absolute than fate itself. It was a quiet, powerful testament to their mutual defiance. He helped her sit up, pulling her close into the protective warmth of his chest. He saw the genuine, beautiful love in her eyes, devoid of fear or resentment. She saw the relief and absolute devotion in him. The slave who believed she was worthless had lived, the king who believed he was a curse was whole. He gently pulled away, his eyes never leaving hers, and slowly, deliberately, he knelt before her on the stone floor of the defeated cavern. It was not a political gesture of submission, but a profound act of personal fealty. He knelt before the woman who had conquered his fear and resurrected his soul. Chapter 24, The Queen's Ascension. The long journey back to the citadel was quiet, punctuated only by the mutual, constant presence of the stabilized mate bond, a profound, non-verbal connection that spoke of safety and shared future. The political landscape had been instantly, brutally cleansed. The witch council was decimated, the traitorous nobles exposed, and Kaelen's absolute power was restored, but tempered by the hard-won wisdom of his near-fatal mistake. Days later, Kaelen stood in the newly restored throne room, which was filled with the remaining loyal Lycan court and the representatives of the surviving northern pacts. The air was charged not with fear, but with anticipation. Aria stood beside him, no longer pale or withdrawn, but radiating a fierce, quiet grace. Her skin was smooth, the dark runes of the curse entirely vanished, leaving only the beautiful, subtle glow of the permanent mate mark. Kaelen turned to face the assembly, his voice strong, resonant, and deeply intentional. He spoke of the conspiracy, the witch council's lie, and the terrible prophecy that had nearly destroyed his life and his throne. He acknowledged the years of self-imposed guilt and the necessity of his final, absolute choice. Then, he turned to Aria. He did not ask her to take her place, he affirmed her choice. He raised a magnificent crown, not the heavy, austere crown of the previous queen, but a lighter, elegant piece forged of pure silver and mountain crystal. This woman was sold for debt, Kaelen proclaimed, his voice ringing with absolute devotion. She was marked against my will. She was condemned by prophecy. Yet, she stood against a deadly curse, accepted its burden, and fought for my life when I was prepared to surrender my own. He knelt before her again, a voluntary act of profound respect. He placed the silver and crystal crown upon her head, his eyes locked with hers. I crown you, Aria, not because fate demands it of the mark, but because I choose you. I choose your bravery. I choose your worthiness. I choose your truth. Aria accepted the crown, her gaze unwavering. She finally believed, fully and absolutely, that she was worthy of this love, this power, and this destiny. Kaelen finally believed he could love safely, his fear defeated by their shared survival. The cursed king became whole, and the slave became his chosen queen. Two broken souls, unified by choice, stood together, ready to rule their destiny.